Well, Jesus' last words before he died were, "It is finished." I would challenge you to come up afterwards and tell me any more poignant or significant last words spoken by someone. Sometimes people's last words can be poignant, sometimes they can be tragic, sometimes they can simply be bizarre. So, for example, apparently, Winston Churchill's last words were, "I'm bored with it all." And Beethoven is reported to have said, as his last words, "The comedy is over." But I want us to this morning think about the last words of Heinrich Heine, the German poet. Heinrich Heine's last words were reported to be, "Of course God will forgive me. That's his job. Of course God will forgive me. That's his job." Now let me know afterwards if you can imagine any more presumptuous final words than those. Of course God will forgive me. That's his job. But I start with those words because their attitude, the attitude of presuming upon God's mercy, resonates powerfully with the parable we're looking at this morning. Now remember, as we've been going through these parables of Jesus, no parable of Jesus stands on its own in isolation. They're all spoken by Jesus in particular contexts. And the context helps us understand what the meaning of the parable is. So what's the context of this parable? Well, we'll look at verse 1. Jesus spoke to them again in parables. Well, who is he speaking to? Who is the them that Jesus is speaking to? Well, 2 verses earlier, chapter 21, verses 45, we read, "When the chief priests and the Pharisees heard Jesus' parables, they knew he was talking about them." So the who Jesus is speaking this parable to is still the religious leaders, the Pharisees, the religious leaders of Israel. Jesus is speaking this parable against them. In fact, this parable, much like the last one, challenges the presumption of the religious leaders. Jesus says through this parable to them and to each one of us, if we're prepared to listen to him, don't presume on God's mercy. Or in other words, don't presume to say, "Of course God will forgive me. That's his job." Let's look at the parable together. Jesus tells us there's a king. And it really shouldn't surprise us by this point in Matthew's Gospel to discover that the king has a son. Because in the last parable there was a son as well, wasn't there? And Jesus so far through the Gospel has been declared to be the Son. He is the Son of God. And the son of the king in the parable is getting married. Hooray! And all the invitations have gone out to those who've been invited to the big day. But when it comes time for the wedding itself, when it's all things are absolutely ready and the fattened cow has been slaughtered and it's on the grill and everything's ready, the servants are sent out to all the guests to say, "Now's the time. Come now. It's ready." But one by one, they begin to make their excuses. "Oh, sorry. No, I've double booked. I can't make it. Sorry, I've got a backload of work. I've got to get on with that work. Sorry, I'm washing my hair. I can't make it." And they turn down the invitation. But more than just turn down the invitation, in verses 5 to 6, they mistreat the messengers of the king who's invited them. They mistreat them, and in fact, they even kill them. And so the king comes in judgment against their city, and he tells his servants, "Fine. Send out invitations to others. Send the invitations to other people." And sure enough, they do that, and many new people come. But the parable doesn't end there. There's one final twist, isn't there? When the king sees that one of these new guests is not wearing his wedding clothes, he banishes him from the banquet into the outer darkness. So the question is, well, what does the parable mean? Jesus tells the parable against the Pharisees, but what does it mean? First, we need to remember that, don't we? This parable is spoken against the religious leaders of Jesus' day, the religious leaders of Israel, and it speaks against their presumption. Much like the parable of the tenants from last week, we see here a retelling of the Old Testament story of Israel's history. God had chosen to bless a particular people. He had chosen Abraham and his descendants Israel to bless them, and through them to bless the whole world. And he consistently sent his messengers, his servants, his prophets to them, saying, come, come, God is preparing a great banquet for you. Come to his banquet. Come and receive his blessing. And he beckoned and welcomed and called. But Israel consistently rejected God's call. In fact, time and time again, they persecuted the very people who brought the message. God's prophets were persecuted and some killed. And so eventually God's patience runs out, and he commits that he will come in judgment against his own people. And I think what we see here in the parable, do you see in the parable, the king comes to the city and burns the city down of the people. I think we see there a reference to in AD 70 when Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed by the Romans. The Pharisees in many ways stand for the whole of Israel at that time. They had begun to presume on God's mercy. In fact, this is what Jesus warned at the very beginning of Matthew's Gospel. Right at the beginning of Matthew's Gospel, all the way back in chapter 3, the first time that the Pharisees are on the scene in chapter 3, we read this. Chapter 3, verse 7. When he saw many of the Pharisees and Sadducees coming to where he was baptizing, he said to them, "You brood of vipers, who warned you to flee from the coming wrath? Produce fruit in keeping with repentance. And don't think to say to yourselves, we have Abraham as our father. I tell you, out of these stones, God can raise up children for Abraham." See, they were presuming to say, well, Abraham's our father, so we're going to be all right. Jesus says, do not presume on God's mercy. And so back to this parable. As Israel, because of their presumption, refused God's invitation, a new invitation goes off to the whole world. And it did, didn't it? In the first witness of those first disciples, it went off to the whole world. And as new people respond to God's message, God does something new. The church is established, a new body made up of both Jews and non-Jews from across all the nations, all people on the earth. God is doing a new thing. But even here, the danger of presumption remains. Because at the end of the parable, one of those who's been newly invited turns up at the wedding banquet not wearing his wedding clothes. If presuming on God's mercy was a real danger for Israel, then it also remains a real danger for each one of us today. And this guest presumes just because he's been invited, he can rock up in his work clothes to the wedding. But he's sorely mistaken. And because of his presumption, he too is cast out from the wedding banquet. Overall, the message of the parable is clear, isn't it? Do not presume on God's mercy. Do not presume to say, of course God will forgive me. That's his job. That was the problem of the Pharisees, the first guests in the parable. It was the problem of the new guest who turned up not in his wedding garments as was thrown out. And I think, having gone through the parable, there are two vital applications for all of us from this parable. So to stick with the language of the parable, here are the two applications for each one of us. The first one is this. I think Jesus is saying to all of us this morning in this parable, make sure you RSVP. Make sure you RSVP. In 1 Corinthians, the Apostle Paul, quoting the prophet Isaiah, says, "No eye has seen, no ear has heard, no mind can conceive of what God has in store for those who love him." God has an indescribable, inconceivable future planned for you. He has invited you to a great heavenly wedding banquet. And Paul says, even if you tried, you could never conceive how wonderful it is going to be. He sealed that invitation with his own blood. But here's the thing. You've got to RSVP. You've got to. You've been invited, but you need to respond. God has literally moved heaven and earth to make this happen. He's stopped at nothing to make a future for you that is beyond description. He's literally gone to hell and back to make it happen. But you've got to RSVP. God is offering everything he has, all of heaven's riches, in his outstretched arms. But you've got to respond and take them. You have to receive by faith what God is offering you. This parable, like many of Jesus' parables and the rest of his teaching, shows us tragically that there will be those who miss out. There will be those who miss out. Not because they weren't invited, but because they didn't respond. There will be those that presume they'll be okay with God and presume on God's mercy. But Jesus says, no, you must RSVP. To put it in theological terms for a moment, this is where everyone switches off, but bear with me. To put it in theological terms for a moment, Jesus here does not teach universalism. Universalism is the heresy that says at the end of the day, everyone will go to heaven. Well, Jesus doesn't say that, does he? Jesus says through this parable, not everyone will be saved. Not everyone is going to the wedding. There are those who do not RSVP. Make sure you RSVP. Even today, through this passage, through this sermon, right now, this very second, you're receiving the invitation. Don't ignore it. Don't metaphorically place it on the mantelpiece to deal with later. No, respond to God today. Say that simple prayer. Jesus, thank you for inviting me to spend all eternity with you. I'm sorry that I don't deserve it, but thank you that despite that you died to make me clean. Help me to live for you. Make sure you RSVP. That's the first message from the parable. The second message from the parable is this. If the first was make sure you RSVP, the second is make sure you stick to the dress code. Make sure you stick to the dress code. In the parable, there were those who missed out because of their presumption over the invitation. But there was also that man who missed out because of his presumption over the dress code. So Jesus says to each one of us, make sure you stick to the dress code. The presumption of this man was that he thought he could simply waltz into the wedding in his scruffy work clothes. What he needed to do was put off his old clothes and put on his wedding clothes. And outside of the world of the parable, the wedding clothes stand for the fruit of a changed life. The fruit of a changed life. That's again how the Apostle Paul puts it in the letter to the Ephesians. He says this in chapter 4, verse 22. to the church there, you were taught, with regard to your former way of life, to put off your old self, which is being corrupted with its deceitful desires, and to be made new in the attitude of your minds, and to put on a new self, created to be like God, in true righteousness and holiness. The problem with this man is that he presumes he can simply walk into God's presence unrepentant and unchanged. Now, of course, the invitation is free, isn't it? The invitation is free. And the invitation is solely received by faith. You can do nothing to earn the invitation. It is given freely by God, and you receive it freely by faith. But God still wants to work in our lives the fruit of repentance. Or to put it in other words, as James puts it in his book, faith without works is dead. Make sure you stick to the dress code. Don't presume on God's mercy. Be sure to bring about a changed life. And of course, the changed life in the story of the parable is a positive thing, isn't it? For example, when's the last time you got invited to a wedding and you thought, fantastic, I'm really looking forward to go to the wedding, but I have to put on all those clothes. You don't do that, do you? You go, fantastic, what an opportunity. I get to dress up and all these things. The last wedding I think I went to, Jason, was yours and Chloe, and I loved it. I loved, I'm not a massive shopper. Rebecca took me shopping and we had to get a suit and things like that, and I didn't enjoy the actual process of buying the suit, but putting it on was great. Dressing up and going, it's joy, it's celebration, isn't it? Repentance is not something you bemoan and go, I've got to put on all these smart clothes now and dress up. It's joy and celebration. The changed life of righteousness is something that's full of joy. There is celebratory joy in repentance. So don't presume on God's mercy. Make sure you stick to the dress code. Live a changed life of repentance. Jesus then finishes this parable with those stark words that I'm also going to finish with. He finishes it, doesn't he? He said it all, and he says, because many are invited, but few are chosen. In other words, the church is going to extend this heavenly invitation to many, many people. You are receiving it today, this very moment. Many are invited. But on that final day of the wedding banquet itself, sadly, there are going to be many whose response shows that God has never truly been at work in their lives at all. They have never put on the robes of repentance and new life. Heinrich Heine, the German poet, said, "Of course God will forgive me. That's his job." But Jesus instead says to each one of us, do not presume on God's mercy. Make sure that you RSVP and make sure that you put on the dress code. Let me pray.